Andrew Neil, arguably the most feared political interviewer in Britain, the man who's reduced cabinet ministers to stammering wrecks and made prime ministers visibly sweat under studio lights, sitting across from Keir Starmer, expecting another standard politician's dance of evasion and rehearsed soundbites. But then something absolutely extraordinary happens. Starmer drops a bombshell so unexpected, so completely off-script, that even Andrew Neil, the unflappable veteran of 1,000 political ambushes, is left genuinely stunned. Now I know what you're thinking. Politicians surprise Andrew Neil about as often as it rains upwards, but this moment, this was different. This was the kind of television gold that reminds you why we still bother watching these interviews in the first place. If you haven't already subscribed to British Mirror, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, then smash that notification bell, because we're diving deep into a moment of political theatre so delicious it deserves to be dissected frame by frame. And trust me, you'll want to catch every twist we've got coming your way. Let's set the stage properly, shall we? Andrew Neil isn't your average interviewer lobbing softball questions and nodding along politely. This is a man with decades of experience eviscerating politicians from every corner of the political spectrum. He's interviewed prime ministers, presidents, and dictators. He's the journalistic equivalent of a heat-seeking missile programmed to detect waffle, dodge, and spin from miles away. When you sit down with Andrew Neil, you don't just prepare talking points, you prepare for war. Your media team runs you through every possible angle of attack. You rehearse responses until they're muscle memory. You know he's going to come at you hard, and you'd better have your armor on. So when Keir Starmer agreed to sit down with Neil, everyone expected the usual tactical bout. Starmer would attempt his lawyerly precision, trying to navigate Neil's questions with carefully calibrated non-answers. Neil would press and probe, searching for weaknesses. We'd all watch, possibly enjoy a politician squirming a bit, and then move on with our lives. Standard Tuesday evening political programming. Except that's not what happened, not even close. The interview started predictably enough. Neil opened with questions about Labour's economic policies, probing at the contradictions between Starmer's promises and the mathematical reality of funding them. Starmer responded with his trademark measured tone, hitting his prepared points about growth, investment, and working people. Classic political tennis, back and forth, serve and return, nothing particularly explosive. You could practically see viewers at home starting to check their phones, figuring this was going to be another forgettable encounter destined for the political graveyard of unmemorable interviews. But then Neil shifted gears. He pivoted to a question about Starmer's previous statements, comparing current positions to past commitments. This is Neil's signature move, the historical receipts attack. He's brilliant at it because politicians hate being confronted with their own words, especially when those words directly contradict what they're saying now. It's like watching someone's past self testify against their present self. Uncomfortable doesn't even begin to cover it. Now, typically, this is where politicians deploy what I call the politician's prayer. Deny, deflect, reframe, and run out the clock. They'll claim they've been consistent all along, that you're taking things out of context, that circumstances have changed, that what they really meant was something completely different from what they actually said. It's a dance we've all seen a million times. We know the steps, they know the steps. Andrew Neil definitely knows the steps. But Starmer didn't dance. Instead, he stopped, looked directly at Neil, and said something that made everyone in that studio sit up straighter. He admitted he was wrong, not sort of wrong, not wrong in a qualified, heavily caveated way that actually means he thinks he was right but circumstances changed. Actually, genuinely, straightforwardly wrong. You could practically hear the record scratch. Andrew Neil's eyebrows, those magnificent instruments of skeptical expression, shot up his forehead so fast they nearly achieved orbit.
because politicians, especially party leaders, especially prime ministers or aspiring prime ministers, simply do not admit they were wrong on national television. It violates every rule in the political playbook. It's considered career suicide. It's the kind of thing media handlers have nightmares about. If you're just joining us and haven't subscribed yet, seriously, what are you waiting for? Hit subscribe and ring that bell, because British Mirror is where we break down these moments that everyone else glosses over. The silence that followed Starmer's admission lasted maybe 2 seconds, but in television time, in that charged studio atmosphere, it felt like an eternity. Neil, to his credit, recovered quickly. This is a man who's interviewed everyone from Donald Trump to Nigel Farage without missing a beat. But you could see the momentary recalibration happening behind his eyes. This wasn't the response he'd prepared for. This wasn't in the script. When you spend your career interviewing people who'd rather chew glass than admit error, encountering someone who just straight up owns their mistake is genuinely disorienting. What made it even more remarkable was what came next. Starmer didn't just admit he was wrong and move on. He explained why he'd changed his position, and he did it without the usual political fog machine. He talked about new information he'd received, about complexities he hadn't fully appreciated, about the difference between opposition positioning and governing reality. It was like watching a politician have an actual human conversation rather than broadcasting from planet talking points. Radical stuff, this honesty business. Now, let's be clear about something. I'm not here to canonize Keir Starmer or suggest he's some kind of political saint who's transcended the usual games. This is still a man who's made plenty of questionable decisions, reversed himself on multiple issues, and engaged in the standard political maneuvering we've come to expect from Westminster. But in this specific moment, in this particular interview, he did something genuinely unusual. And in our current political landscape, where admitting error is seen as weakness and consistency is valued above correctness, unusual is worth examining. The political calculation here is fascinating. Traditional wisdom says you never, ever admit you were wrong. You stick to your guns even when they're pointed backwards. You maintain the fiction of unwavering consistency because voters supposedly hate flip-floppers more than they hate being lied to. Margaret Thatcher's "The Ladies Not to Turning" became iconic because it embodied this principle. Steadfastness, even stubborn steadfastness, was seen as strength. Flexibility was weakness. Changing your mind meant you didn't have principles. But here's the thing that politicians and their handlers often miss. The public aren't actually idiots. We know circumstances change. We know that governing is more complex than opposing. We know that sometimes new information should change your position. What we hate, what really drives us mad, is being treated like we're too stupid to notice the contradictions. We hate the insulting charade of politicians telling us that black is white and expecting us to just nod along. So when someone breaks that pattern, when someone actually treats us like adults capable of understanding nuance, it's genuinely refreshing. Andrew Neil, once he'd recovered from the initial shock, did what any good interviewer would do. He pushed harder. He wanted to know if this newfound candor extended to other policy reversals. He brought up additional examples of Starmer's changing positions. He was essentially asking, is this genuine, or is this just a clever new tactic? Is this authentic self-reflection, or strategic repositioning dressed up as honesty? Fair questions, those. We've all been burned before by politicians who seem real until you realize it's just another performance. What was striking about Starmer's responses was the consistency of the approach. He didn't revert to type when the pressure increased. He continued engaging with the questions directly, acknowledging where he'd shifted positions and explaining why. Some of his explanations were more convincing than others, certainly. Some felt like genuine evolution, while others seemed more like political necessity dressed up as principle. But the overall tone, that willingness to engage rather than deflect, remained constant throughout. The reaction online was predictably split, because everything in our polarized political environment is predictably split. Starmer's supporters hailed it as proof of his integrity, his willingness to be honest with voters, his refreshing departure from standard political behavior. His critics dismissed it as weakness, proof that he lacks firm principles, evidence that he'll say whatever's politically convenient. Both sides found exactly what they were looking for, because confirmation bias is a hell of a drug, and we're all addicted. But stepping back from the tribal warfare for a moment, what this interview revealed was something potentially more significant than one politician's debating tactics. It exposed the absurd standard we've created for our political leaders. We demand that they never change their minds, never admit error, never show uncertainty. Then we complain that they're robotic, insincere, and disconnected from reality. We've created an impossible bind where honesty is punished and artifice is rewarded. Then we wonder why our politics feels so fake. Think about it in any other context.